Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Connecticut Psychological Association Social Justice Speakers Series. We have our early career spotlight tonight with Asia Perkins and Dr. Maria Crouch. They will discuss reducing racial and ethnic diagnostic disparities for disruptive behavior disorders and ADHD, and American Indian and Alaska Native substance use, decolonizing and indigenizing clinical care. A warm welcome to both of you. My name is Shiva and I'm the co-chair of this committee. I'm joined today by my planning committee members, Mena and Neda, hopefully Anne and Jenna will join us. And at this time, I would like to say thank you to our sponsors who have been helping us to sustain this series. As you see on the slides, we have 3 levels of sponsors right now. At the platinum level, we have comprehensive neuropsychological services, and I'm so proud to say that I'm affiliated with this company. And also at the platinum level, we have Heart for Healthcare. Thank you so much. You see your beautiful names also here as supporters and friends. Also, thank you to the Health Foundation, Connecticut Health Foundation, for their support. They gave us grant to improve the infrastructure of our planning committee. So, Dr. Ankley, thank you for making it possible for us to receive this grant. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Neda to share with you additional information.
On behalf of the Planning Committee, we are thrilled that you could join us this evening, and we hope that you continue to attend future speaker sessions. The SJSS is in our 2nd year of programming, and we are committed to combating racism, promoting community healing and social justice, and most importantly, being advocates for change. Tonight is our 7th speaker series this year, and we are excited about the presentation from Asia Perkins and Maria Crouch. As a quick reminder, the CPA SJSS offers free monthly meetings to CPA members, the broader Connecticut community, and to our nationwide supporters. I welcome you to our speaker series this evening, and now I will turn it over to Mina to introduce our speakers.
At this time, I'm going to introduce our speakers for the evening. Asia Perkins is a 4th-year graduate student in the Clinical Psychology PhD program at the University of Connecticut. Her current research interests focus primarily on the etiology and identification of disruptive behavior disorders and how those disorders interact with individual dimensions of psychopathic traits to impact developmental trajectories and treatment response. Additionally, she's interested in studying the factors that influence racial and ethnic diagnostic disparities regarding disruptive behavior disorders and how provider and teacher biases contribute to inaccurate and ineffective treatment recommendations. We're also welcoming Maria Crouch, PhD, who is a clinical community psychologist and a postdoctoral fellow at Yale University School of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry. Her clinical work and program of research is focused on the intersection of trauma-informed care, evidence-based practices, and practice-based evidence, indigenous approaches to address alcohol and drug issues, trauma, and related health impacts of social determinants among American Indian and Alaska Native communities from a cultural strength-based approach. Please welcome our guests.
Hi, everyone. Okay, I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so you should be able to see it. And for those of you who kind of trickled in maybe after Shiva, introduce the title of my talk, I am talking about reducing racial and ethnic diagnostic disparities for disruptive behavior disorders and ADHD. So I'll start off by talking or introduce, let me move this thing. It's so big, okay. I'll start off by introducing and discussing disruptive behavior disorders or DBDs and ADHD. Then I'll talk about diagnostic disparities, the reasons for those disparities, and how we can work to reduce them. So to start, I wanted to make sure everyone is kind of broadly aware of disruptive behavior disorders and ADHD. So I'll talk a little bit about each. According to the DSM-5, ODD is characterized by a persistent pattern of angry or irritable mood, argumentative or defiant behavior, or vindictiveness lasting for at least 6 months. So people with this diagnosis may exhibit a lot of temper tantrums, temper outbursts. They may seem like an irritable person who thinks others are out to get them. They might be very touchy. They might annoy others intentionally, things like that. CD is defined as a repetitive and persistent pattern of behavior that violates the basic rights of others or major age-appropriate societal norms. So this is a bit more severe. So they might assault other people, commit theft, have aggression towards other people, animals, engage in truancy. And then ADHD is defined as a persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity impulsivity with functioning or development. So they may excel in a variety of different ways and struggle in others, like having a hard time planning, organizing, sustaining attention on things that aren't particularly enjoyable, managing time, etc. So oppositional defiant disorder, ODD, and conduct disorder, CD, are prevalent disruptive behavior disorders. And the people who get diagnosed with ODD or CD are considered disruptive to the people around them. They might be called uncooperative, defiant, aggressive, angry, disrespectful to authority, etc. And ADHD used to be placed in that same category of disruptive behavior disorders until 2013 when the DSM-5 came out. So now it's considered a neurodevelopmental disorder, but that history still has lingering effects on people's understanding and perception of ADHD. So people tend to prioritize the possible inconvenience that a person with ADHD has on others rather than the internal experience or the lived experience of that person who has ADHD. Some also believe that these three disorders look similar or they look the same. However, I would argue that we need to think more critically and dive below the surface. So instead of looking just on the outside at the behaviors, we need to think about the context of the behaviors and the why. Why are those behaviors cropping up? And one example is that some teachers or clinicians view behaviors as disobedience, resisting rules, defiance. It's our job to determine what was asked of them, how did they respond, and why did they not do what was asked of them by their teachers, their caregivers, whoever is in a position of authority. If it was OD or CD, they might throw a large tantrum, they might throw a chair, they might become physically aggressive when asked to do something because someone else in a position of authority is telling them what to do, and sometimes that triggers something inside of them. If it's more on the ADHD side, it's more likely that they have been asked to do something that requires sustained effort, sustained attention, or sitting still, which they may not want to do in that moment, or they may not be able to at that time. Or they may not have understood the instructions because they were unclear or they weren't developed for neurodivergent students. And then they're viewed as defiant or questioning authority for asking clarifying questions to understand what was asked because they should just know like everyone else. So those behaviors may all be perceived the same. Sometimes you hear they never listen, they're challenging my authority, but those behaviors are different. They have different whys, and those differences should be acknowledged and explored. So we can get into the notable disparities. When I talk about disparities, I'll talk more broadly and then kind of trickle down to disruptive behavior disorders and ADHD. So since its inception, the field of psychology, it hasn't been particularly culturally sensitive, inclusive, it hasn't necessarily practiced cultural humility since the beginning. And as an example of this issue, many of the samples used to study assessment measures, diagnosis, treatment interventions have an overrepresentation of middle-class white males in particular, and an underrepresentation of pretty much everyone else. And if you haven't thought deeply about that and its impact on our understanding of all people and mental health in general, think about your own area of expertise. And I'll kind of ask you some questions to ponder. So think about how many research articles you've read in your own area where the sample is 75% white or 85% or 100%. And how many times the authors may have minimized the importance of a diverse sample and just generalized the findings to everyone anyway. And then what impact does that have on our treatment of people, our conceptualizations as clinicians, and our field in general? The consideration of race, ethnicity, culture, and other factors have kind of been treated as an afterthought, and that's no different when it comes to researching disruptive behavior disorders and ADHD. So with that standard put into place, culturally normative behaviors can be overlooked and labeled as psychopathology in marginalized and minoritized populations, and misdiagnosis can be quite common for people of color, particularly for Black Americans or African Americans. For example, such as the case for high rates of schizophrenia diagnosis for Black men, where understandable wariness and apprehension are seen as unreasonable paranoia. So that means that there are people out there who are experiencing racism, poverty, other forms of oppression, and they're receiving antipsychotics because their reasonable reactions to their circumstances are pathologized. More specifically to our conversation today about DBDs and ADHD, researchers and clinicians have witnessed the racial and ethnic disparity regarding higher rates of conduct problems and disruptive behavior disorder diagnoses, especially for Black and Latina youth. So for example, Black youth are 2.5 times more likely to receive a conduct disorder diagnosis than ADHD in comparison to non-Hispanic white peers, and they're 5 times more likely to be diagnosed with adjustment disorder than ADHD. Black and Latina youth are also much less likely to receive ADHD medication when needed, so they don't get proper treatment and they don't necessarily see the noticeable improvement their white peers might see. Little has been done to fully understand or address this disparity. And while research has found that there is a racial ethnic disparity for these issues, few studies have explored potential influencing factors and kind of connected them all together. So why are these disparities happening? There are a variety of different reasons, but first we have to think about environmental and financial factors. So previous research has shown a strong association between economic hardship and more severe conduct problems. And when we think about economic hardship, who is more likely to experience that? Typically Black and brown youth. And to provide some additional context, sometimes youth have to make a hard decision between stealing something, which is considered a symptom of conduct disorder, and going hungry. Or sometimes they have to make the choice between going to school and prioritizing their education, or skipping school, which is another form or another symptom of conduct disorder, to work a job, maybe to help their caregivers make ends meet. Also, economic hardship is stressful and can make it more difficult to regulate emotions. So these youth may exhibit more symptoms of ODD aligned with the irritable dimension of ODD instead of being more vindictive or spiteful. And they also may be more prone to developing depression. Perceived racial ethnic discrimination also plays a role. And when I say perceived, that is not in any way to negate the reality of the discrimination, but more to highlight that the person on the receiving end perceives it to be discrimination instead of something else. And so Black and brown youth experience racial and ethnic discrimination from a very early age. It's an additional stressor on them, a stressor for them, which can negatively impact physical and mental health and development. So things like cognitive development, inhibition, coping skills, self-control, and more. And with that decreased self-control, decreased coping skills, there's an increase in maladaptive coping and conduct problems in youth. We can also talk about environment in schools. Teachers and the school system in general exhibit racial and ethnic biases toward their students. There's a lot of research, including eye tracking studies, that have shown that teachers on the lookout for challenging behavior are much more likely to monitor Black children more closely, especially Black boys. They're kind of on the lookout for negative behavior, even if there isn't any. Additionally, teachers, particularly white teachers, display lower distress tolerance with Black and Latina children. So they become more frustrated or angry more quickly with them than with white students. They're also more likely to describe and report behaviors of Black and Latino youth as challenging, disruptive, or more frequent in comparison to white children who display similar behaviors. In some settings, roughly 25% of white children may be reported for having behavioral concerns and referred to treatment in comparison to roughly 40 or 45% of Black and Latino children. Black and Latino children are also more likely to be negatively impacted by things like zero tolerance policies, receive harsher punishments, and may be required to go through an entire treatment plan that might not actually be helpful or relevant to keep from being expelled from school. And then on the clinical side of things, as clinicians, we come in to work with a family or youth, and we collect a bunch of information from family members, caregivers, teachers, and any other relevant people in the client's life. It's our job to look at all that information and evidence and interpret it appropriately to diagnose when it makes sense, and accurately determine which treatment to use or suggest. However, we can sometimes forget that we are filtering all of that information through our own subjective lens. So if you live in the United States, then you live in a society with really strong negative messages that Black and brown kids and adults are naturally more aggressive, more defiant, less intelligent, less sensitive to pain and punishment. They need harsher consequences, etc. There's also this idea of Black and brown people just can't help but to get into trouble and be bad. That's what people are looking for because that's what's expected based on those messages that we're all constantly receiving. And we may not think that we have entertained or internalized that messaging, but we likely have at some point. So we need to think about that playing a role. It's not our fault that we received those messages and we continue to receive them, but it is our responsibility to acknowledge them, combat them, and make change. And when we forget to do that, or we don't realize it, or we don't think it's all that important, we can miss some pretty crucial elements, symptoms, or context that might help us understand the full picture and come to a more accurate conceptualization. And we can enact a lot of harm on young children, adolescents, and their families when we don't think things through, we don't check ourselves, or we don't at least consider some differential diagnoses that might be more accurate or helpful to the client. Again, clinicians are way more likely to give an ODD or CD diagnosis to Black and Latino youth who don't meet criteria for those things, or they actually have ADHD instead. So they aren't receiving adequate treatment, and that is definitely not okay. So we know that. So we're thinking, what now? What can we do? One thing we can do is to try to adjust our biases, and we can do that by using the prejudice habit breaking intervention by Devine, Forscher, and colleagues. That's just one example. So instead of believing that we all have unconscious bias that is outside of our control, which we know is a belief that can have negative consequences and kind of backfire, we can shift our thinking to belief or to bias being a habit. It was a habit that was formed over time, and it's a habit that can be broken over time. And we can do that by increasing our awareness and our concern about our biases. We can work to understand our own role in enacting harm with our biases. We can get motivated to overcome them, and we can use strategies to reduce them. So I'm not going to go over the entire intervention, but I can explain the core components of it, and you can consider whether you do any of them currently or not, and what you could do better and maybe more of. So the first component is stereotype replacement, where you recognize that you and society generate responses to and about people. You label those responses that you have, you reflect on why those responses happened, and you replace those harmful or stereotypic responses with non-stereotypical responses. The second component is counter stereotypic imaging. So this means that you can conjure up examples of people who are not in your in-group, who kind of go against popular stereotypes for that group that you're thinking about. It's not going to like cure everything, but it's a start to thinking about things outside of those stereotypes. The third component is individuating. So you move away from viewing people as part of a monolithic group, and instead you start observing their personal characteristics. There are going to be pieces from that group that might be relevant for that individual person, but you don't want to make your own assumptions about what those pieces are, or that all people from that group are the same. The fourth component is perspective taking. So as you're kind of gaining these skills over time, you can start to put yourself in the shoes of someone from that marginalized group who might be seeking an ODD, CD, ADHD, or whatever other diagnosis. And you'll think about it from a first person perspective. What would you feel in that situation? Do you feel heard by your clinician when they say X thing? Do you feel validated by your clinician when you say X thing? Did your clinician make an assumption when you said X about you? And the final component is contact. So maybe you look around at your friend group, your family, your colleagues, and you realize that you don't know many people who are different from you. It can be hard for some to empathize or understand or care for people when you know nothing about them or their experiences, or you don't have someone in your life who shares an aspect of that person's identity. So when you increase your exposure to other people who are different from you, your world kind of opens up and you can become a better, more informed researcher, clinician, and person. And so if this is something that you're interested in learning more about, maybe for personal growth, or maybe you do kind of work with people who have disruptive behavior disorders and ADHD, I definitely recommend looking up the prejudice habit breaking intervention. It could be a good starting point if you haven't done this type of work before, if you just need a refresher. And before I move on to the next slide, I want to acknowledge that this intervention is reflective and you can benefit from conversing with others to learn and grow while you do it. However, for anyone who needs this message, please don't find like the one person you know who happens to be from that marginalized group you want to know more about, and then force them or place the burden on them to educate you. It's kind of unfair for you, for them for that to happen, and there are other resources out there for you if they don't necessarily want to have those conversations. What else can you do? So you can also review the demographics of clients in your clinic. So think about the clients who come in your clinic. Do you see more youth of color with ODD and CD diagnoses? And then you see more white youth with ADHD diagnoses in your clinic? Have conversations about that. Ask yourself why that might be happening. Are those diagnoses accurate? Did bias have some sway? Just think critically about it. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't be diagnosing Black and Brown youth with ODD and CD at all. Sometimes people think that. But sometimes those diagnoses are accurate, and sometimes they are very helpful when thinking about interventions that would be effective. But thinking through it more critically might uncover something else that's also important. You can try and check in with yourself to assess your level of burnout. So when we're running on fumes, we get frustrated, we get irritable, we get easily agitated, exhausted, and sometimes less compassionate. And that has a detrimental effect, not only on our overall judgment, but also our ability to combat those biases we may have when we're talking with a client and trying to determine whether ODD, CD, or ADHD, or whatever else is the best fit. We also might start thinking, oh, our work doesn't really matter. I can just kind of slap a label on it and get it done. And then you start cutting corners and missing things. And that's not providing ethical treatment. So we need to be mindful of that. Further, we should all be considering the role of culture when assessing symptoms and thinking through diagnoses. Families from different racial groups, different ethnic groups, different cultures can all describe symptoms or experiences differently than we might, and our interpretation of their descriptions may change the meaning or the importance or the severity of what's going on for that client. So for example, Black or African-American parents are sometimes more likely to emphasize disruptive behaviors when they're talking about them. And sometimes Asian or Asian American parents are a little more likely to de-emphasize those same behaviors. Again, I say sometimes, the groups are not monolithic. Kind of having these differences in mind can help prompt you to take a more holistic approach when considering diagnoses. Also, to ensure that you are at least considering or asking about culture, you can complete a culturally informed interview, such as the CFI offered by the DSM. So sometimes you go, oh, I know what I'm going to ask, and I know the information I need to gather. And then you use this interview, and you notice a question that you would never ask, and you ask it to your clients, and they give you some really relevant information that adds additional context and might entirely shape the diagnosis and go, oh, that makes way more sense given this additional information. So it's important to do that. We also need to be really intentional and thorough when it comes to understanding each disorder and diagnosing them. The amount of times I've heard someone say that they can just kind of tell that a child or an adolescent has ODD or ADHD or whatever else they're looking for without actually going through the list of criteria has been way too many times to count. 0 times is the correct amount of times for that to happen. Just take the extra minute, take the extra 2 minutes, or however long it takes you to think about that particular client, hold them in mind, and review each of the criteria based on the evidence that you've been given about that person. Sometimes you do that and you realize, oh, they don't actually make criteria. They're like 1, 2, 3 items away from meeting criteria. And I just assumed based on X, Y, and Z. Or you realize that something else might be a better fit when you consult the differential diagnosis section, where it kind of tells you how to determine which one to choose. Just be more intentional about it. And finally, you can get involved in politics and public policy. So we all advocate for change, whether it is better understanding of mental health, improved financial stability, increased safety, improved healthcare, and more. We can reduce misdiagnosis or the prevalence of some of these disorders at a higher level than working solely at the individual level in therapy and things like that. So for example, some of the kids who have conduct disorder diagnoses or sitting in juvenile detention likely would not have engaged in some of those behaviors that got them that diagnosis and got them in juvenile detention if they didn't feel like they had to in order to survive. So you can get involved at the state and the national levels. CPA and APA are committed to advocacy efforts. So you can reach out to both of those and see how you can join and make a change. But you can also get involved in institutional politics, institutional change wherever you are, because I can assure you that every place has some level of politics and some level of change that should and could happen. So you can advocate for more diverse faculty and a student body in your department. So you have diverse viewpoints and you kind of have more of a holistic approach. You can advocate for more culturally informed and humble curriculum or protocols. You can look at what's missing or who is missing from your institution, and you can advocate for those people or things. And sometimes we get these harmful messages about who should get what diagnosis, what races act in what way, etc., from our professors, our trainers, our supervisors, our colleagues. We have to challenge those messages and replace them with more accurate and helpful messages as early as possible. Where could we be if we did that instead of having to deprogram ourselves later? Thank you. So if you have questions, you can email me. Here's my email address. You can also follow me on Twitter. But then I will pass it over to Maria.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Perkins.
Okay, thank you so much, Asia. That was fabulous. Really appreciate it. So let me fix my screen here. So Dogaden, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. Today I'm going to talk about substance use disorders, or I call them SUDs, among Native American populations. But first, I just want to say a day hello to you. I know I was introduced, but my name is Maria and my Diagnostic name is Tavo, and I'm of the Decolonizing and Kultekin tribes. And I'm originally from Alaska, and I've been in Connecticut for a little over 2 years. And I live and work on the traditional lands of Algonquin and other peoples who are the stewards and have resided here for time immemorial. So I want to give a brief overview today of Native people, history, culture, historical trauma, incredibly brief, but I must. I want to talk about SUDs and treatment, and then share a video related to Native wisdom and healing. I also want to mention that I'm going to share some cultural ancestral wisdom in my talk today. Please consider that it could be true. Consider that other ways of knowing and viewing the world are equally as valid, and there are multiple realities, if not at least multiple perspectives. In Indigenous cultural teachings, the truth is a sphere or a wheel or a hoop, and we all stand at different points around it, each holding a unique piece of the truth. But first, I'd like to start in the good way with a traditional story. So in Native cosmology, the Western Hemisphere, namely North America, is known as Turtle Island. And as the story is told, a long time ago, after the Great Mystery, the world was covered in water, and many creatures lived in the sea and air. Eventually, the time came and Great Spirit Woman, or Mother Earth, was prepared to give birth to her new children. But they were not as much water or air creatures as the others. They needed land to be planted to live and grow. The animals wanted to help Great Spirit, and so they heard that the makings of land were buried deep under the water. Animal after animal swam down to retrieve some of the earth, but all failed time and again. Finally, a tiny voice spoke up and volunteered. Everyone was shocked and surprised because it was Muskrat, the least of the water animals. He dove into the water. They waited and waited. When the animals thought all hope was lost, Muskrat's little body floated to the surface. He gave his life, but in his tiny paw was some earth, because where the great had failed, the small succeeded. Then that earth was placed on a turtle's back, and Great Spirit planted her prepared seeds there. Turtle and the earth began to grow and grow and grow into the land that we live on today. This story is embedded in meaning making, history, hope, healing. It exemplifies the holism of Native culture, our understandings, interconnectivity of all things, and the notion that mind, body, emotions, and spirit, they're unable to be separate, and they need to be balanced in order to achieve healing. Plus, we may be small in numbers, but don't count us out, ever. So I'd like to share an incredibly brief overview of how Native peoples in the US, if you will, have been impacted by colonization. 1492, America is discovered. Rather, it's invaded and a great death ensues. By 1790, Indians, as we've been so called, were forced inland. By 1830, Indian country starts to develop, which leads up to the reservation era that follows. 1860, you see an immigrant stampede. Westward Ho, Manifest Destiny, these things are in full swing. By the 1890s, there is great impacts to Native people and land. There were boarding schools, policy to kill, and other forms of decimation. In the very bottom, you see present day Turtle Island. We see the effects of trying to relegate and eradicate Native peoples. But currently there are 574 federally recognized tribes. There are 175 indigenous languages. 2.9 million people identify as Native alone, whereas 2.3 million identify as mixed Native ancestry. And then 22% live on reservations. So the majority reside in urban centers. Now, Alyeska, or Alaska, where I'm from, is derived from the Unuga word that means great land or mainland. Alaska's colonization began much later than the lower 48, but it was a similar narrative. And as you can see on the right, the land has been greatly reduced and it follows a similar pattern, except for reservations. Alaska only has one. And on the left, Alaska Native people represent 8 distinct tribal groups composed of 229 of those 574 federally recognized tribes. So there's great diversity there. So I can't tell the story of drug and alcohol addiction in Native communities without talking about traumas. It is important to recognize that trauma has occurred on the physical, emotional, mental, social, cultural, spiritual, all of the levels for Native peoples. And research shows that historical trauma can lead to community level responses: suicide, decreased connection, weakened social structures, family violence, child maltreatment, substance use problems. Edward Durand is an American Indian psychologist, and he coined the term soul wound for the spiritual soul level nature of traumas that are commonly expressed through intergenerational trauma, lateral violence, and of course, substance use disorders. And so he says, trauma occurs when there is an injury where blood doesn't flow. What is being conveyed in the idea where blood doesn't flow is that the injury is transcendent of the body and blood, which is the lifeline of our being in the physical world. The imprint left by the injury on the psyche, the soul, will need healing. If healing does not occur, the injury or the trauma will remind the person through symptoms that there is a need to heal the original injury. So let's look at some of the symptoms of soul wounds. Data from Sampson indicates that Native peoples have the highest rates of alcohol, marijuana, methamphetamine, opioid, inhalant, hallucinogen, and tobacco use disorders compared to the general pop. 4% of Native people have an illicit drug use disorder. Native people are more likely to report drug abuse in the past month or year than the other groups in the US. And nearly 1 in 5 Native young adults has a SUD, and approximately 4 in 10 adolescents have a lifetime prevalence of illicit drug use. In terms of alcohol use, data taken from SAMHSA shows that Native people are using alcohol less than some other groups. However, Native people experience more alcohol use disorder in contrast to all of the age groups. And nearly 25% of Native people report binge drinking in the past month. That's in contrast to 11% in the general population. And Native people have the highest rates of severity for lifetime prevalence and alcohol-related morbidity and mortality. Alcohol is a leading contributor of increased death among Native people. Understandably, there's a long and complex history with alcohol. But in Native culture, everything has a spirit, and alcohol is no exception. All substances come from the earth and the earth's awareness, and by nature of existing, they have awareness, which can be used for good or harm. So everything is about achieving balance, using the medicine in the right way, or abstinence, not using the medicine at all. Since alcohol is spirit, it wants spirit in return. In the negative way, this means that alcohol is slowly taking the life of the person, their spirit, in return for what it can offer: fun, relief, numbing, forgetting. So in this Native understanding, alcohol is an outside entity that interacts with the person. Just like, think of depression and anxiety. Those can be viewed as spirits that visit from a Native perspective. For example, depression is often cyclic, such as a visitor. Treatment and healing are through ceremony. Talk therapy is ceremony, and medicine, offering tobacco as respect to the spirit, or even taking antabuse, which internally acknowledges and extricates the negative energy. It's also talking to the spirit of alcohol or the drug. For example, if a person's having a strong craving, they could say, "I know that you're here, and I ask that you do not visit me." Treatment also includes ceremony in naming. So Native people's identity becomes fused often with that of an alcoholic or addict. And this is the same as fusing with the emotional impacts and the ideas of historical trauma, that you're defeated, you're worthless, you're worthy of punishment. The person is then encouraged to identify rather with their legal name, or better, if they have it, their Native name. Undoing historical trauma is key to healing from substances. To quote Duran again, he says, "When the soul is wounded, it goes back into the black world, or the unconscious. This regression makes a huge spiritual gap in the person who has been wounded. Because natural law dictates that soul or spirit seeks itself, it follows that the person begins to seek spirit, and attempt to find spirit, find material spirit, the spirit in a bottle." And historical trauma is not situated in history alone. It is contemporary. It has images, systems, and structures that support it. Native people are exploited in the media and are often depicted in really incongruous ways at best with culture. Examples include mascots, Halloween costumes, even being shown in a headdress, because for the majority of tribes, that's reserved for ceremony. And there are many myths that exist and persist. And I'd like to share with you some of the most damaging. One, we are a dying group. This narrative is the idea that Native people are infantile, savage, need Western culture to survive, let alone to heal and thrive. Two, we are easily identifiable. The reality is that tribal people look different. There are 574 federally recognized tribes. That's a lot of diversity. In addition, tribal identity has always been connected to the community that you serve, not your blood quantum. You could think of it more in terms of nationality, because blood quantum requirements are another tactic to systematically erase Native people. For those unfamiliar, Native people were the only group that we have to carry a card, a blood quantum card issued by the government to prove our blood in order to get benefits, scholarships, healthcare. Number three, we intuitively know our culture and history, and we're heavily spiritual. Learning a Native language, values, traditions, these take a lifetime, if not lifetimes. Plus, many of these have been stolen and systematically erased. While traditional Native worldviews are spiritual in nature, Native people are not, they're people. 4. And if you take anything away, take this. One of the most damaging myths to persist is that we are genetically susceptible to alcohol. The firewater myth, that's how it's formerly been called. We now call it the biological vulnerability to alcohol, because both the naming of that myth and the use of firewater are rooted in racist practices and even research. So the myth of biological vulnerability is that Native people are more susceptible to the effects of alcohol and also more vulnerable to alcohol problems due to a biological or genetic difference, which is false, and it perpetuates racist beliefs in inferiority. The reality is that alcoholic beverages were known and consumed for ceremony prior to European contact. And here's something that's also really important. Native people have the lowest rates of alcohol, meaning the highest rates of abstinence. So you have a disparity in alcohol use disorder, but you have the highest rates of abstinence also. So it really depends on what story you want to tell. As you can see, the histories and the stories about Native people are sorted and varied and often based in assimilation or extermination narratives. But research asserts that cultural sensitivity is not enough, and cultural competence suggests that there's some type of achievement or endpoint. But culture is alive, it's always changing. The concept of cultural humility really lays claim to this idea that part of the treatment is our own healing, our own personal process of change, and this due diligence of seeking to learn and to know about the cultures we serve. Above all else, working with Native communities requires cultural humility. This is where there's a focus on self-humility rather than achieving knowledge alone. So that means there's no end goal on this process you do, it's lifelong learning. We have to be comfortable in not knowing. We must strive for balance of power and to create and nurture relationships that live in that balance. And the most important skill for understanding the culture of another is understanding our own and challenging our own biases. All the more imperative for cultural humility and appropriate treatment, given that disparities exist in SUDS. But for me, and from what I've learned from my elders, culture is prevention, medicine, and healing. Transitive is a Diagnostic word meaning I woke up, I'm awake. It's the idea that if Native people know who they are, they know how to heal. And many have had who they are taken from them through colonization, these inequities, health disparities. It's causes to symptoms to this cyclic nature of trauma. But the elders teach that if it can be regained and reclaimed, it can, because it lies within us as Native people. So culture doesn't determine behavior, but rather it provides this framework where someone can understand themselves, their environment, and their experiences. So culture shapes our belief systems about what constitutes mental health, mental illness, addiction. It influences symptoms, patterns of coping. It determines how we seek help, and it's a major factor in how Native people use and respond to treatment. Oops. Another example of culture as medicine I'd like to give is that for time immemorial, the Great Plains Native peoples have been finding strength in the buffalo. To them, the bison provided this endless supply of necessities. I mean, everything down to every part of the animal was used and served a purpose, even the nose gristle. The buffalo is also viewed as an ancestor for the Great Plains people. And this is really important because this also intensified the trauma when colonizers came and systematically slaughtered the buffalo. So in the picture on the left, you can see some people standing on the slaughtered buffalo bones. And that's an attempt to kill Native people by removing their source of food, their livelihood, and a spiritual symbol. Historical traumas have been found to increase sadness, anxiety, and anger. And these are all things that contribute to addiction and relapse. So an Indigenous relapse prevention project, which is on the right, was developed because they worked with and they wanted to identify stressors that could be causing addiction and relapse. Through that project, they observed that community members felt that the intervention should address family, particularly the family of the individual who is struggling with relapse. And that differs from the Western models that typically focus on the individual. They observed that participants reported that they have, all of them did, in fact, they've been told in rehab and treatment that they must do it for themselves and they can only recover if they get sober for themselves. But what they found was that was culturally inappropriate because participants said that they didn't do it for themselves. They did it for their parents, their kids, and their people. They also observed that community members who stopped drinking and avoided relapse were more engaged in cultural activities, sweat lodge, ceremonies, powwows, beading, things like this. And something that's really important, the buffalo also serves as a powerful metaphor for recovery because the buffalo are the only animals that don't hide from the storm. Instead, they turn and they walk directly into it. So I had an opportunity to conduct a video project documenting Alaska Native elders, their views about mental health, healing, addiction, and SUDS treatment. And this video can be found on the YouTube channel of the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. And in the video is an Athabascan elder and Reverend Anna Frank, and she's talking about working with the Native community in this way, in the right way, in a cultural way. So I'd like to share that with you now.
The traumas that we have in our lives, sometimes we don't know what to do with it, but it's like going to school. If you don't go to school, you're not going to learn different things. And to go to different groups of people in your communities will help you learn about the traumas that you just hang on to and don't know what to do with. Someone say something that will help you. And we have to reach out. I just did 2 funerals in one village. And that village will go through grieving all by itself, you know, because people moved out of there. And so no one will come in there and help them. And we have to teach them how to help themselves. We have to teach someone there to take up some kind of responsibility to help feed the people the right healthy spirit. And if you don't do that, then the village will just go down more and more drugs and alcohol will come in. And so we have to learn how, again, to feed the right spirit. And sometimes it takes an outsider to do that. But I find if you don't feed the community and help them, then nothing ever changes until you feed the people the right thing to do. And sometimes it takes longer. I don't know why. Maybe it's because it's not our way of doing things. We take on a lot of the roles of the non-native, and we're afraid to reach out, and I don't know what we're afraid of, to hurt more of the people or to hurt us. Or I think we have to talk about that too. If you're going to become a helper, then what must you do to be that helper? I know I had to learn a lot about me first. If I ever wanted to help change people in the village, I have to change. I have to find out, why am I so crabby all the time, you know? Or why do I cry all the time when the death comes? Maybe it's because I never really talked about death in my life that has hurted me in the past. And I have to take that responsibility and to help myself, and then once I learn how to do that, then I can reach out and help others. That's what I really had to do, is I had to teach me first. And once I taught myself, or someone helped me, then I reached out just gradually. And to me, that was the most helpful thing to do, is to help one person to become to feel comfortable with what she has carried with her all these years. And we just did a workshop in the villages with Roots and Wings, we call it. And we work with herbs, natural herbs. And we had a 90-year-old woman there finally say, I was abused by 3 people in this village. How long do we have to carry our burdens? Until she felt comfortable. And until people feel comfortable, you have to keep reaching out. You just keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, until you reach people that say it's okay to come. If they feel that they're not going to be hurt anymore, they decide to let it go now.
Another Alaska Native elder, the late grandmother Rita Pitka Blumenstein, has said of healing, the past is not a burden. It is a scaffold which brought us to this day. We are free to be who we are, to create our own life out of our past and out of our present. We are our ancestors. When we heal ourselves, we also heal our ancestors, our grandmothers, our grandfathers, and our children. When we heal ourselves, we heal Mother Earth. So Native communities are resilient and hold the inherent strengths for treatment and healing within their cultures. Dogadin, thank you. And here are some recommended readings for you if you're interested. And I'll stop.
Thank you so much, both of you, Asia and Maria. Both of you mentioned extremely important information. You know, Asia, I'm impressed by this study that they conducted about the eye tracking and our biases that might be related to that. And Maria, when you said how family is important to target relapse in Native community and the importance of focusing on collectivism approach in you know, instead of individualistic approach, it's crucial. It's crucial. Thank you for sharing all of those with us. Do you have any question?
Good evening. I don't have a question. I just want to say to both of you, this was a great presentation. Like a lot of important information and resources. And thank you for just coming to share your work with us. And you also both have very great presentation styles. So I just wanted to give you your flowers for that as well. But yeah, I don't have any question. I just wanted to say kudos to both of you. This is really amazing.
Thank you, Jenna.
Thank you both.
I want to say the same. Thank you so much. It's given us a lot to think about. So thank you.
Thank you, Anne.
You have a being like you had at home, right?
I just want to say, Maria, I love the way you combine the words of the elders with your data in your presentation. So many times as an evaluator, I'm searching for disaggregated data in Native communities in Connecticut and can't find it, but I do have the words of the youth and the elders in that community. So really loved how you combine that in your presentation.
Thanks for your feedback.
easy before you look back. Like I suggested. Yeah, so that helps.
You guys blow me away. The quality of these presentations is such top flight, but more importantly than that, I just feel this tremendous urgency to not have us get together each month and have such valuable presentations be preached to the choir. And, you know, our capacity to interact, or our opportunity to interact, enhances our capacity to be with each other. And so just being here and being present, and the powers that be, do something wild, like give people $15 off on next year's dues for every recorded SJS that they document viewing. So let's do something wild to get this out there. I keep saying this every time, but I feel helpless. I want to know. I don't feel capable myself of getting out a message that would bring more people in. It's just so valuable, guys. Help me out. What do people have to say about it? Is it just me? If it is, I'll just be quiet.
First of all, Stephen, thank you. Yeah, it's not just you. This is one of the things that I think is like our goals, all of us, even participants here in tonight, just to help us to get the words out, to tell people about these presentations, to let them know, Paula, you are here. Let the other students at Albertus know such important these presentations are. And also, Stephen, because you brought it up, we are planning to do an in-person session in October 7th, in October, which is going to be on October 17th, Monday. So we want to see if we do it in person and just bring people together. The event is going to be at Albertus, and we do hope to see you in person at Albertus.
I question whether our membership at large has any idea whatsoever about the importance of this resource. You know, I grew up in a progressive family, big deal, except that looking from there and looking around to the rest of the country, I'm just so clear how important dialogue and interaction is. And every month you guys put up both of you tonight, incredible work. Just everything from breaking my heart every month to giving me hope every month, and to having most importantly, a sense of more connectedness. I mean, I keep turning up as the only white boy here, but I can tell you, if more white people felt more connected to more different kinds of people, to where we slice and dice ourselves down to actual individuals interacting, you guys are you have such a resource here. And I just want to figure out, it's not just marketing, of course, but somehow, okay, I already said I'd be quiet.
And Stephen, I do want to just quickly mention, I know for me personally, one of the reasons why I didn't go down the clinical path was exactly what you're kind of talking about when it comes to, okay, I can train myself to be as culturally competent as possible, but I'm only one person impacting a select few of clients, and what are ways that I can make changes in that larger scale. And that's something I still grapple with. I thought maybe going into research may help. And then as I moved up, I realized most people are not reading the literature that we're publishing. And so I think it takes time, and I think it takes a lot more of interactions with people outside of our circles, because once again, people who attend these particular sessions regularly are the ones that care. But I don't think it's just a psychology issue. I think it's also, you know, your neighbors, your relatives, your friends, your family members. The more exposure they get to different concepts, the more they're able to change their perspectives. I grew up Middle Eastern. My parents come from a background where they did grow up with racist ideologies from a very young age, because back when they were living in Iran, most of the films they got were films from the US, where most African Americans are criminals. And when they came to the US, they had all of these stereotypes and they had lots of discrimination. And it took a long time for them to move past that. And a lot of that also stemmed with me and my friends growing up and helping to shift that mindset. And so, you know, these sessions are great, but it's also those small little conversations you have with everyone you interact with when they start to kind of see people in a different light. And so I think this work is great, but it's something that we need to attempt to trickle down into different areas of our lives as well, and not let it defeat us, because it's very easy to sit here and think that there's not much you can do, but there is.
I totally get that. You're amplifying what I'm saying, because I'm just saying, how do we get our colleagues to get more? But you're right. How do we spread it in our whole life? I just feel such a responsibility as a psychologist for our colleagues, for our guild, and our guild is offering this. Thank you, you guys. What you've done, it's awesome.
Thank you so much for sharing. I do appreciate that. I also see on the chat, yes, a question. Asia, have you seen the question?
Yeah, so sure, I can kind of elaborate a little bit. So some people use Latinx, some people use Latine. There has been some debate in the community about the two different terms, and some have said that Latinx with the X at the end doesn't necessarily blend as well as like Latino. So Latine is just kind of a way to add like a vowel at the end and make it blend more with the language.
Thank you. Any other questions from our speakers?
Thank you so much for your presentations. Really enjoyed it. Hope you do more work like this. We definitely need it.
So I have just two questions. Maria, about using a collectivistic approach for Native communities, where can we get some information, find information, or get trained?
Well, I provided the books. I mean, that's, I think, one way. But there are also, I guess the thing is too, is that going back to that slide about the myths, you probably have treated Native people, right? And maybe you didn't know because they didn't say they didn't come and say I'm Native or whatever. But I think that there's the Society of Indian Psychologists, which is a division of the APA also. And I'm a part of that. And I think there's resources there. There's particular trainings, there's things like that. There's a conference that is free, that's offered every year, that provides, research, clinical work, all of that. Yeah, I could list the books as well. But I think there's different ways like that you can engage with. And I could think of some more and email them also if people are interested, in addition to the list of the books, to just learn more. Because there's an Alaska Native elder named Marie Mead, and she says we all were Indigenous at one point. So indigenizing and decolonizing, it's not just for me, it's for you, it's for all of us.
Excellent, thank you. I remember when I was on the training years ago, I received collective training for relapse. And I was directly involved with collective training. But when I came to the US, I changed my training. So sometimes I get confused where to go. But thank you for just bringing this to our attention, because I have seen the dramatic impact of collectivist approach on relapse.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Asia, Maria, is there anything else that you might want to share as conclusion?
I have a question, not to jump in, but as we're concluding.
Sure.
Maria, are you aware and willing to share of any Connecticut-based kind of social justice-oriented organizations that us as psychologists or people in the community could become more familiar with or involved with?
Good question.
Or collaborate with? If you don't know now, maybe it takes some time to think about, and that's fine. But I'm just wondering kind of what's in our sphere in terms of collaboration and learning.
Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll answer these questions in an email, and then I'll send it to you and to others I've been communicating with, because I just was on a project where we were talking with community groups about well-being and community health and things like that. So I learned a lot about what people are doing in community in terms of the artist activist community. And there's somebody is doing tours, and they do them for the med students as well, but they can expand. But they do tours of Fairhaven and New Haven and locally about the history, like the colonial history through present day. And I think those types of things are really, really powerful as well. And I think that's an act of social justice, to know the real history of the place that you reside. Yeah. But I'll send an email.
Thank you. So if there's no other questions, first of all, thank you so much, Asia and Maria, for your wonderful presentation. As you mentioned, Stephen, every time I listen, I learn. Thank you so much for all of those trainings. Thank you so much for all of you that participated tonight. Thanks for your time. So we are gonna do the closing remarks, sending it over to Neda.
And once again, I just want to quickly also reiterate what everyone is saying. This was actually one of my favorite social justice series sessions that I attended for several reasons. I don't think we get enough training or focus on Native American populations in general, in just historical context, let alone within our field. And so I think, Maria, what we are doing is so vital and so important, because a lot of people who were born and raised in the US don't really fully understand the scope of that. And also, Asia, I'll self-disclose that I actually do have ADHD. And during your presentation, one thing that really surprised me is I got diagnosed very late as an adult. And I think a lot of that stemmed from the fact that I would go in and they would see me coming from a background that is Caucasian, white, I had decent grades, and they would never really think that it may potentially be ADHD at the time. And it wasn't until I was a freshman in college when I started to kind of put those pieces together, when I took my intro to psych course. And I've worked with lots of children that have been diagnosed with conduct disorder, ADHD, as a respite counselor when I was younger. And I would say 85% of them were African American. And so this really kind of shifted the way I thought, not just about my own diagnosis, but also about so many of these children that are put on medication that may not even work at a very young age. And so what you're doing is also really powerful. And so I just wanted to kind of reiterate all of that before we end. And yeah, so we just want to thank you all for joining us this evening. I would like to invite you to complete our post-survey link that is being added to the chat now. Your responses to our survey will help us in planning future sessions. Our next speaker series will be on September 22nd at 7 p.m. With Dr. Roberto Abreu. And I would like to end by mentioning that our ability to maintain the social justice speaker series is through fundraising, and we greatly appreciate all donations moving forward. If you are able to support, the donation link is also in the chat. Thank you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you next month.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care.